Hi there. Writing. Do we need to write? I don't write very much when I learn languages, but when I was learning Chinese, I wrote a lot. To learn 4,000 characters, I took the position that I had to write the characters out longhand. The first 1,000 I wrote many, many times each one. I had my own sort of special system for learning them, and I continued to write them. I had to write for the final exam. So it was studying Mandarin was a full-time job. I learned about 4,000 characters. I wrote a lot. Obviously, I wrote a lot of French because I studied in France for 3 years. I was a university student there. We had all kinds of essays to write in French. But all the other languages, I don't write them hardly at all. I write a bit on the computer. I've written some in Japanese, occasionally in Spanish. With Russian, I use the phonetic keyboard because I'm just not, I don't want to devote the time to learning, to training myself to type Russian because I don't write often enough in Russian to justify investing that time. So now I'm reading Korean and I keep on making the same mistakes. Like instead of, if it's you know, these little symbols, it's either a O sound or an A sound, and I mistake the O sound for an A sound or A sound for an O sound. And, and I look at it and I should have been able to tell the meaning, but I can't because I gave it the wrong sound. And I remember in Russian, for the longest time, if I saw a word that began with the Russian R, which looks like a P, if I looked it up in the dictionary, I would look up under P rather than R. So it's very hard to get the new writing system ingrained in our brains. And I'm quite convinced that writing is a very good thing to do. Why don't I do it? Because I'm essentially lazy. I learn for fun. I have so much time to spend. And I started trying to write the Korean. I've had several stabs at it. I just can't bring myself to do it because I'm so much more interested in listening and reading, in acquiring more words. So I think it's a matter of choice. It depends how much time you have. I know there are people who say I'm going to learn 2,000 words and I'm going to really learn them thoroughly and I'm going to write them and I'm going to write sentences and I use my Anki deck and I'm going to nail this stuff down. And I'm not that way motivated. I think if I really nail down 2,000 words, I still won't be able to understand Kim Young-ha's podcast. I still won't be able to understand much of what I read in the Korean newspapers. So I'm not so fussed. So that's why I don't write, but I don't necessarily recommend that people shouldn't write. I think writing is a great way to get started in expressing yourself because you have more time to think about it. But here again, typically, I prefer to speak rather than to write because the trouble with writing is you leave all your mistakes out there for other people to look at. When you speak, they kind of flow by. So, for example, I had someone ask me in Russian about something having to do with how you navigate in our linked library to find English content, depending how do you find out whether it's American or British and stuff. So I did a screencast, which I narrated in Russian. Then I sent him a note in English and I wrote it in English. And I said, here's a little file which will explain to you how to do this on our site. Because somehow it almost embarrasses me to write in Russian because I know that I'll make mistakes. Whereas when I speak and I make mistakes, it doesn't bother me. However, probably it's a good thing to write for people who have the time and the perseverance to do so. But I'm always attracted by other stuff. And so even listening to Kim Young-ha's, I've now really worked at the first two transcripts. It's very difficult. Lots of words for which the dictionary doesn't even give me an answer, So lots of work, but, I was on my stepper, listening to it and reading through it, and I get the rhythm of the language. It's so great. I'm still convinced that if I persevere with that, I will have a better sense and feel for the language. And I find that already, just by listening to his podcast, my spoken Korean has improved. And even though I've been neglecting my Korean other than listening to his podcast, often without a transcript, often only understanding 20%, when I spoke to my Korean tutor, he remarked on how much better I was speaking. So I'm attracted therefore, to listening and reading. And of course, the biggest problem right now is that I'm so interested in these events, which hopefully will at some point start to scale down, de-escalate in Ukraine. And one of my listeners here gave me a link to a Ukrainian television station, Channel 5. And it's fascinating because I listen to Ukrainian and it sounds like Russian, and I think I should understand it. And when I first listened, I couldn't understand hardly any. And now the more I listen, the more I understand. And I start picking up words that actually are similar to Czech, like ale and osip, instead of no and, I don't know, человек, whatever. Osip is a person, I think. I don't know, and so I'm getting used to the language. So it's quite interesting doing all that. So with all of that stuff happening and listening to the Russian stuff, following the events in Ukraine. Oh, and I also had a conversation with one of our tutors at Link, Evgeny, and of course we have very different opinions on the events there, which doesn't prevent us from being friends. There's nothing wrong with having different opinions. He has a different, he has accesses different news sources than I do. I see it differently. He sees it differently. That's fine. Fine. It's interesting to be able to do all of that in Korean. In Russian. I wish I could do it in Korean. And I have to force myself, and I will now force myself, although I'm going to watch the end of the third period of the Calgary-Vancouver game, to stay with, Kim Young-ha's podcast. Because if I get to the point, once I'm at the 10th or so, 12th, 15th episode, I know that my Korean will be a lot better. And I will continue to mistake, characters, the O and the ah, but hopefully there again I will get better. I would get better faster if I wrote, but I'm not prepared to sacrifice these other things that I find more interesting in order to write, but that's for each person, obviously, to decide for themselves. Bye for now.